Today, we have a very special guest. We have the incomparable Betsy Levy Paluck. Stephen is going to be giving the formal introduction, but I actually arrived at Princeton for my PhD right after Betsy did, and all of us were amazed at the work that Betsy was doing and continues to do. And she has continued to be an inspiration for pretty much everybody who has worked with her or worked around her or read her work. And so I just want to say we're very excited to have you here today, Betsy. Thank you so much for sharing this time with us. And Stephen, go ahead, take it away.
Thanks for the intro, Drew. So hi all. Today I'm very, very pleased to introduce and welcome Dr. Betsy Levy Paluck to our It's Her Speaker series. Dr. Paluck is a professor of psychology and public affairs at Princeton University. Her research spans a number of important topics, including violence, media effects, norms, prejudice, and peace building in conflict and post-conflict settings. She examines these topics using both qualitative and quantitative approaches in both lab and field experiments, ultimately aiming to improve social outcomes. And as Drew said, her work is some of the most innovative and eye-opening of the last, 15 years. Today, she'll present a recent review on progress and challenges in reducing prejudice. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Betsy Levy Paluck.
Thank you so much for those two really lovely introductions, Stephen and Drew, of course. I'm really happy to be here. Thanks for hosting me virtually. I'm excited to talk about this paper that we published in 2021, and I couldn't have done it without my incomparable colleagues, Roni Porat, who is now a professor at Hebrew University, but was a postdoc with me through this paper. Chelsea Clark, who's in the center there and is a star. Keep your eye on her. She's my graduate student right now. And then my PhD mentor and forever mentor, Don Green, who's a political science scientist at Columbia. So this paper, which is cited right under their pictures in the annual review of psychology, was kind of a full circle moment for me. Previously, I had, as a TA for Don at Yale, been working with him on a class called Hate Crimes and Political Intolerance. And he said to me, the psychology PhD student, I like to try to end on a happy note or maybe a hopeful note. Can you give me the best of what psychology has to offer on how to reduce prejudice and discrimination, hate crime, violence, et cetera? And I said, yeah, no problem. We've got a huge literature on that. And he said, great. I want it to be, an intervention that they tested on people who were actually, targets of the intervention. So, a more realistic intervention and just make sure that it's causal inference, an experiment. I said, great, we love those too. And, I went to the psychology literature and I had a harder time than I thought I would in finding something that would really measure up to, the kinds of issues we had been talking about all year long. One of the things that we had covered was the Rwandan genocide, which then inspired me to go on and do some of the dissertation work that I did. And so that really prompted me to go out and do this enormous literature review to say, like, well, what does work? What is out there? And we kind of hoovered up all of the literature. So, not just in psychology, but targeting all of the social sciences and going back just as far as we could, as far as, records would allow. And it resulted in this piece in the annual review of psychology that I'm showing here. And one of the big concerns of this paper was that actually there was very little evidence relative to the whole body of work on what works to reduce prejudice that was causal. So there were, millions, actually, it felt like, of great innovations and dozens of theories and good ideas. But a lot of the programming resulted in kind of like a customer satisfaction survey at the end, or a pre-post survey. And as everyone here knows, all of the bias in terms of who signs up for these projects is always foremost in mind when you're trying to interpret the results. So one of the things that we called for in this particular review was more experimental work, more causally identified work. And we also wanted more work that was actually in the field. And here the field just means done with the people who you're actually trying to change, right? So not doing proof of concepts in the lab with students, but it's fine to do it with students if that's who you're actually trying to change. We just wanted more of, the actual targets of change to be involved in these studies. And so that actually turns out to be, 2009, that was quite a while ago. And so we decided to do it again and to see maybe how the literature had responded either to our paper or others who were making similar calls. So we asked 3 questions in this paper. First, what's happened in the last dozen years since we wrote it? What are the average effects of interventions? So unlike last time when we included everything we could find, including qualitative evaluations, we only included experiments from the last dozen years on prejudice reduction from any discipline. And then finally, this paper asks whether we can answer the public call to reduce prejudice in the world. And when we were writing the paper, the public call to reduce prejudice got a lot louder than it is on average. And so it was particularly peaked in this moment to be writing this paper. So I'm just going to get right to our answers. I'm just going to give them to you now. We'll get into all of the details, and you can tell me whether you think that my answers are well supported by the data that we gathered. Okay, so the first thing is that what's happened in the last dozen years, there's been an uptick in prejudice reduction research, which is excellent. And some of this research is going to become classic. And I don't mean the kind of research that you want to teach in a prejudice reduction class. I mean the kind of research you'd want to teach in an intro psychology class. There are some really outstanding studies. We call them our landmark studies. We describe them in detail in the paper, and I'm going to talk about some of them today. However, the modal research is very different from these future classics. And part of that is mechanical. Of course, it's the mode. It's not one of the outliers. But how is it different? Well, there are actually many reasons not to trust the majority of the research, unfortunately. And I'm going to get into reasons why. But relatedly and very specifically and importantly, some of our most popular prejudice reduction ideas, those that are most treasured by psychologists, but also by the lay public, are not well supported. So they're in that bucket of ideas that might not have enough evidence to really justify launching a large intervention or to convince a policy skeptic. And then finally, and most damningly, the most rigorous research we have from the last dozen years shows very small reductions in prejudice. Okay, so that's the talk. That's it. I want to get to at the very end, in hopes that you'll stay around for all of the weeds, telling you how we came to those conclusions, what the next generation of prejudice reduction research should look like in terms of the way our co-author group is thinking about it. And then finally, we want to ask the question, are we using the right model of change? Okay, and this goes beyond our data. This is now into my sort of op-ed time, and I'll save that for the end as well. Okay, but first let's get into the uptick in prejudice reduction research. So here you see what I'm talking about, starting back in 2007 when we last ended the literature search. That black line tracks just the actual number per year. It's going up to almost 60 a year in 2019. And it's really driven by this blue line and the red line. So mostly lab experiments, but also online experiments really become a force in this field, especially in 2015 era and going on. Field experiments, which is what we called for a dozen years ago, they're not driving this increase. So that's sort of puttering around at about 1 to 3 per year. And let me just tell you how we got all of these numbers. So we used biomedical standards for our meta-analysis, by which I just mean that this is a completely transparent analysis. So this is probably a little bit too small for your screen to see, but what I'm just showing you is a Prisma chart in which we tell you exactly how we found all of the studies that went into the meta-analysis, at what point we threw certain ones out. All of our data, all of our code, all of the references, and everything are on Dataverse for you to look through. I'm not sure if you're seeing that the text isn't coming up very well, but I apologize if that's happening for you too. Okay, so how did we get it? We searched 5 separate databases and we got over 16,000 non-unique results and spent a glorious summer narrowing that number down to about 1,800, which everyone read in full. We had a trained team of research assistants who at the very least had a master's degree to help us out. Our criteria for inclusion, we defined prejudice as animus, so really broadly defined. We left out sexism in order to keep in tune with the previous meta-analysis. It's an interesting question of why. I'm happy to get into that. We also left out partisan prejudice, which is actually a really new area of inquiry. It's on the rise, so keep your eye on that. We also left out collegiate bias. And so while we did include, fictional biases, we left out, Ohio State versus Michigan prejudice reduction. They also all had to be experimental. So there had to be some kind of randomization to, intervention versus a placebo or control. Our final sample was about 418 experiments, and we coded them all. We grabbed all of their quantitative results, but we also qualitatively coded them. So we could tell you, what's going on in these interventions, what were the motivating theories, what were aspects of the study, and then we'll get into that. Okay. So as I also mentioned, another conclusion is that, some of these studies are just going to be classics. They're wonderful. You should know about them. Why? First of all, they grabbed our attention because they had really robust interventions. They were well described. You could really, take these interventions and implement them, sometimes even based on the way the study was written. So the methods were right there for you. They were very realistic. They sometimes, took into account not just the social psychological, but like political processes as well, and the context and recognize what was going on. So they're implementable. Also, they use very robust methods to test whether or not they were working. So large sample sizes, they measured behavior, not just self-report. They attended to randomization. This is something that happens, is that, there might be trouble with self-selection and so forth, but they used the right econometric methods to correct, in particular, if individuals were randomly assigned versus classes, and they clustered their standard errors appropriately, shared their data, all of the good stuff. Okay, and so one really interesting thing about this group, it's a really varied group. They're using different theories, different interventions, and what they have in common is that they all have promising outcomes, but they're very small. So it's very limited in terms of what outcomes they observe. Okay, so I want to give you a couple of examples. One thing I want to highlight for you is that almost every single one was led by a doctoral student. All right, so all of us, full tenured professors, we have no excuse. I include myself in this too. So they're really the younger generation is all right. 2 different studies, one Matt Lowe in India and one Salma Musa in northern Iraq, ran these experiments where they were using sports leagues as a context intervention. And so in cricket, it was randomizing men to be on the same teams or on opposing teams with lower caste men. So high caste men having contact with lower caste men. In northern Iraq, it was Muslims and Christians. And what was just so notable about this is that, in one case, they even designed the entire league in order to test the question. They went into questions about the contact hypothesis that you'll be surprised have never actually been tested before in the long, gloried history of the contact hypothesis in psychology. So, is one condition of contact, cooperation, actually necessary for, the positive outcomes? Because in all cases, people were having contact by playing against members of the outgroup. But in some cases, they were cooperating with them because they were on the same team. You'd be shocked, but we've actually done another meta-analysis on contact, and we find that, people aren't testing these conditions of contact. They also did amazing things like testing the boundaries of contact. So does it extend to policy attitudes? Of course, also, does it extend to people who are not on the team? And they did all of the right stuff in terms of, wonderful methodologies and methodologies you can really trust. Okay, so another study another doctoral student, Kevin Munger at Columbia, used bots before bots on Twitter were as widely known, designed a really elegant 2x2 experiment to test ideas about confronting racism. And so in this study, Kevin went and found white presenting men on Twitter, according to their avatars, who were using the N-word as a racist slur in the past 3 to 4 weeks or so. He randomly assigned a bot who was either presenting as a white male or a black male, and as either high status, meaning lots of followers, or low status, meaning very few followers, to confront that person for their use of the N-word and saying that it wasn't acceptable. And what's really beautiful about this design is that then Kevin just follows those Twitter users. So he has incredible longitudinal data and basically is seeking to detect what kind of a person would prevent recidivism, right? So using that word again, is that confrontation effective, at least getting them to not use that word again, for example. The next one that I want to highlight is Edward Chong, who collaborated with a wonderful team to contribute one of the only field experiments of diversity training in the past dozen years. And this was done with a global corporation, so it's actually an enormous study. You can really test the heterogeneous effects that we always want to test and never have enough power to. And so what they find is that a one-off training, an online training, essentially affected women and people of color who worked at the corporation. What many would consider the people who are not, the primary targets of such a diversity training. And another thing that I thought was just so notable about this study is that they went to such great lengths to measure behavior. So the company, didn't have opportunities to follow up on the diversity training that could be recorded and shared with the evaluation team. And so they worked with the company to create a diversity coffee hour and just track to see who signed up as a mentor following this diversity training to mentor more junior women and people of color. It was again the more senior women and folks of color who signed up. So these are just tremendous studies. There are more. I really encourage you to go to the paper and read and learn about them. They're international. There's just so many great aspects to these studies, international, domestic, everywhere. The modal type of research, as I already told you, one of our conclusions is very, very different. And I'm just giving you this bar chart now to show you the different bins that we put all of the different kinds of intervention approaches in. There's lots of different figures I could show you in terms of highlighting differences, and we'll get to some more. But one thing I want to talk about here is just the sheer proportion of studies that did study contact. But note that this wasn't the face-to-face contact of Musa or Lowe that I just told you about. And what is so notable to me, this top bar that occupies a third of all prejudice reduction studies in the last dozen years, it's as though the literature has decided that contact is so effective that face-to-face contact is that, or we could say the actual contact is no longer necessary. So extended and imagined contact are now the ways in which people have been mobilizing contact on average, or for the majority of the time, in intervention studies. So if you're new to this literature, it's interventions in which you're told that a friend of yours has had contact with an outgroup member, or you're asked to actually just envision having a conversation with an outgroup member, say a Black person, if you're a white person. In terms of the other most populous bins, cognitive and emotional training were the next, and that's a somewhat large bin that includes all different ways that people are trained to control and sort of reshape the ways that they think about or feel about outgroups. And then the third category is social categorization, which is a really, like a historically very popular category of training people to think about outgroups as part of the in-group by redrawing the boundaries of groups, or to think about the group boundaries in different ways. So what do I want to say about the modal research? I'm sorry. I think that my laptop has been hobbling through the pandemic and is now starting to stumble to its close. It's a little frozen here. I know what's coming next, so I don't know what you can see right now. And Stephen or Drew or anyone, you can let me know.
We can see the D and the standard error.
Yeah. Oh, okay. It just went back. Okay, great. So I want to say about the modal research before we get to the D, although now you know the D, is that this modal type of research is different for a few reasons. First of all, the majority of it is about prejudice reduction through mentalizing. I think that's what I want you to take away, is that that's where we are now. So these interventions are all about changing your mental life, your emotional life when it comes to prejudice, right? So it's not about changing your context. It's not about changing your interactions. It's not about changing your institutions. It's about your mental and emotional life. Very much linked to that is that we had a code in our database that we called light touch, which is a bit of policy jargon. We, as social scientists, defined it very clearly by saying a study would be binary coded as light touch if it met the following requirements. It had to be 15 minutes or less, so very brief, cheap, and easy to implement. So there's a little bit of judgment involved. We had 2 people agree on it. 76% of all studies were deemed light touch interventions, testing light touch interventions. The other way in which I've kind of already previewed for you by saying that there's a lot of reasons not to trust the majority of the research is that modal, the mode for the research that we saw had a great number of methodological problems. So small sample size, a lot of attrition without accounting for it correctly in the analysis, cluster randomization, but then analyzing individuals rather than taking into account the fact that you've, assigned entire classrooms or groups. And then an overall lack of transparency, right? So really, really difficult in some cases to back calculate the actual effect size, which anyone in this audience who's done a meta-analysis is, I know, with me on. And so here are the other figures that I mentioned. I'm going to breeze over these, but these are all in the paper. Basically, I'll just highlight for you here that the types of outcomes remain explicit attitudes and beliefs, self-reported attitudes and beliefs, or if we're going to talk about behavior, people saying what they intend to do rather than measuring what they are going to do. We're still very focused on race and ethnicity as a type of prejudice appropriately. An emergent category of prejudice is immigrants, asylum seekers, and refugees, which also absolutely tracks with the times. And then in terms of intervention settings, we're still doing most of it in college settings or on MTurk. Okay. Let me pause here, by the way, to say that I forgot to set the expectation that I'm really happy to be interrupted at any point. So I get excited and talk fast, but Stephen has instructions to break in if you want to type something. I absolutely want to clarify or to go back and forth with you about anything along the way. Okay. What's the average effect? You now know it's D equals 0.357, standard error 0.02. So for those of you who aren't fluent in D, who need a little context, let's say we took a feeling thermometer. That effect size would bring someone who's toward the colder end, cold being 0, warm being 100. Let's say it's a sort of maybe a minor prejudice. It's right below neutral at 40. That would take a person to 48. Okay, so if you step back and think about that, maybe that's pretty good. First of all, it's in a positive direction. Second of all, I've already told you that, most of these interventions are light touch, 15 minutes or less. So maybe that's actually pretty good directional change and size of change for something that minor. But before we get too invested in that, I want to show you something. We wanted to investigate the average effect size a bit more. This is the absolute hands above the table, not weighting anything average effect size. We're going to keep our hands above the table, not make any judgments about study quality. I've already griped to you enough about that. You may disagree with me on some of those things. What I'm just going to do here is I'm going to split up all the studies by quintile in terms of how many people were in the treatment. So this is, not something that you need raters for. And what you see in this first row here for treatment sample size is that the bottom quintile is 25 people or less. That's really not that many people in a study, right? The top quintile is 78 people or more. Okay, so you can see that this entire literature has small sample sizes in it, right? But what we need to look for now is whether the average effect size tracks these sample sizes, right? It shouldn't, right? You should be finding on average the same effect no matter what. It's a true sign of publication bias if you need a whopping effect size in order to publish a very tiny sample. And unfortunately, that is exactly what we find. It tracks it almost linearly. So the effect size for the bottom quintile is 0.6, almost twice the average effect, whereas the effect size for the top quintile, 78 or more people in the treatment group, not your most impressive sample size. In fact, I bet it wouldn't pass a dissertation proposal review at Berkeley. It's 0.187. Okay, so what is 0.187? Oh, and here's just a figure for people who like pictures like me. So it really just tracks it linearly if you look at the effect size. Okay, oh, I actually even see a chat right now. Okay, yeah, this is a comment too. Leif, I'd love to talk with you about it more if you have a specific question. Are the 76% characteristic of that line of reasoning? Okay, so if you can see the chat, you're noting that we are kind of echoing Apprentice and Miller argument about light touch manipulation. So when small interventions lead to large effects. So that if you see an effect of the light touch manipulation, then you could see even larger effects with more forceful manipulations. I mean, to me, this is an empirical claim, and we can do a little bit of testing of that claim in this data set. I'm going to get to that in a little bit, in particular with respect to more longitudinal studies, but also studies with other characteristics. So I hope that helps. Okay, goodbye chat, maybe. Here we go. Okay, so just to contextualize the top quintile average effect size, it's a D equals 0.187, right? And so this would take our moderate prejudice from a 40 to a 44, okay? Still not bad, right? And still maybe only with a light touch. And so, I think that we can all kind of step back and judge for ourselves whether we're pleased with that. I want to show you that this is true for restricting our sample, no matter what kind of theoretical tradition or even methodology. I'm not going to show you methodology, but I'll tell you that this small effect size for the top sample size is true for field studies, lab studies, and online studies. It's also true for every different kind of intervention if you code it by the type of intervention. So this is the full sample, and this is the sample restricted to only studies with 70 or more people in the treatment size. So you see that many of them head towards zero, and in many cases the standard error overlaps with zero. So what I want you to see is down at the very bottom for diversity trainings, another thing that you can see on this graph is that once you restrict to that quintile, a lot of studies drop out. And for diversity trainings, only 2 studies are in existence from the past dozen years with a sample size of more than 78. Stephen, are you back with a question? Great.
Yeah, there's a question about whether effect sizes vary by year of publication. So especially given the last 10 years of reform in our field.
We don't see that kind of a trend. No, thanks for the question. So keep your eye down there at diversity trainings. This leads to the second or the third, I think, conclusion that some of our most popular prejudice reduction ideas are not well supported. So diversity training, again, literally has 2. I've already told you about one of them. So now you're really well acquainted with the literature. Experiments of any kind that have a sample size of over 78. I think there are a few that we missed that we've since uncovered that had really different language that are really extensive Boolean search missed, but none that would change anything that I'm telling you here today. This includes implicit bias training, by the way, which is a literature that's on the rise. So again, watch that space. But that includes studies of implicit bias training. The other way in which ideas about implicit bias and its reduction, which has been subject to a whole other meta-analysis, and I'm not going to address that right now, but just in terms of thinking here about the ways in which any change in implicit bias might predict changes in behavior. So we were really excited to be able to gather all these data and then to say, never mind implicit bias training, any training out there, any prejudice reduction intervention that measured implicit bias, we're interested to know if they also measured behavior so that we can say, no matter what you did, if you managed to change implicit bias, did you also change behavior? Which is a different way of asking the question, because most studies or reviews in the past have asked whether interventions can change implicit bias, right? So this is, whether implicit bias interventions can change implicit bias. Here we just ask, no matter what you did, is implicit bias related to behavior? And unfortunately, only 2 studies in the entire database collected both actual behavior and implicit bias at the end. And so there's literally no way to tell you that. The other effect that relates a little bit to Leif's question is whether small changes build over time. So this isn't whether now if you scale the intervention up, you'll find a bigger effect. But regardless, I think that one popular claim in the psychological literature at the moment is that there are recursive effects. So never fear if you get small effect sizes. They may grow over time as they are self-reinforced. You carry out a behavior, and that's self-reinforcing on your attitudes, which carries forth in the future. So the way we wanted to test whether this is true in this prejudice reduction literature is, we gathered 5 outcomes for any study, and we let the authors tell us. So this is really like sort of the Instagram, most flattering filter on this entire literature, because we let the authors tell us what were their most important outcomes. We didn't collect everything they took. So we took up to 5. But I'm telling you that if they ever collected longitudinal data, we collected all of it, because we just wanted to know, what is the longitudinal effects of these papers. And again, there were so few papers that did that, we actually don't have enough to meaningfully analyze this. So what I'm telling you here is, I'm not telling you that there's evidence of absence, right? I'm not telling you that diversity training doesn't work. And I'm not telling you that small changes can't build over time. I'm telling you we don't know. And I think that, the way that should materially affect the way you talk about this literature, and indeed the way you maybe think about change in social psychology and the social sciences, should be affected by these findings. It simply means that we don't have enough data, at least from this area of intervention and social psychology, to be able to make these claims. So we shouldn't assume that small changes could build over time. It's an empirical question. And it is one reason to feel a little bit worse about the small average effect of 0.187, right? So it made us feel a little bit less confident that, we should observe that self-reinforcing and growing. There's just no evidence for it. Okay. So the best research shows very small effects. This was my final conclusion. And this figure you've seen before, just in a different way. The reason I wanted to show it to you again is not to depress you, but to fit this regression line and tell you one thing that it might suggest. So if you plot the D, the average, it is an average effect for each study. The average effect of each study of the 5 effects that we gathered from the paper, if you plot that against the average standard error of the paper, what you see is that as the standard error gets smaller, the D gets smaller too. So the less error in the paper, typically meaning the larger sample sizes, the smaller the change they observe. But what you see with this regression line is that it crosses 0 at some point, right? And so one way to interpret this finding, and this is robust to taking out those outliers up there, if your eye is getting caught by the upper right-hand corner, I just wanted to show you all the data. There's no data that's dropped in this figure. What this might suggest to you is that maybe my message shouldn't be, hey, everybody, you should do better methods. You should be more transparent. You should get bigger sample sizes. I mean, that is a message for sure, always. But if we were to do that and just keep using the same interventions we've used for the last dozen years, what this regression line suggests is that all we'd be doing is pushing our effect sizes closer to zero. And maybe what we'd be finding on average after a time is that they're not making a difference, okay? Happily, it's not crossing so early that we might be hurting people, but this is suggesting that the collective efforts, the collective impact of all of these ideas might not actually be positive if we were testing them with the most high-powered quality studies. Okay, so that brings me to my final 2 points, which are more editorial, and I do expect pushback on and hope you will, and would love to engage with you on this. The first being, what should the next generation of prejudice reduction research look like? And, you know, in our paper, we do kind of the traditional thing of, you know, well, here are some ways to improve upon what's, you know, been going on in the past dozen years. And we include suggestions for people who are interested in field work like us, but also who are interested in laboratory work, which we think is still an extremely important space for this work. So we have that all in the paper. Please go see it. I think there are some really great ideas in there, and I want to see some of these ideas realized. But I think a less developed but bolder step to discuss now is to think about just an entirely different model of change. And so one way to characterize this model would be to think more about structures and intervening in structures. So the current model of change that we could characterize it as the following. So even among a group of researchers who recognize that racism and religious inequity and all of these other kinds of biases are written into institutional structures, I think that's a widely accepted fact among these researchers who are doing this research. The problem is still characterized as a psychological one. And the solutions that are being offered are individualized psychological interventions that really attack one's mental life, as we already discussed, in order to create individual psychological and then hopefully societal change. So that's the current model. That's how you would read it if you didn't know anything about prejudice reduction. You just read our review and looked to see what was happening in the last dozen years. That's what you would infer. The alternative model of change that we would like to test going forward, that we think is still open to empirical inquiry, it's not the solution, but really one to test, is that we should attack psychological problems with structural interventions, which will seem like a big mismatch at first. But in order to create the individual psychological change, we don't want to throw out the psychology here. We're not saying it's not important, but also societal change. So what do we mean by this? Classically, we think about structure as institutions, as rules, as leaders, and everything they do, right? So these are levers that change our collective experience, and they're official ones, right? But I think especially important for psychology, since we aren't necessarily sitting around the table at the State Department or at the World Bank or the IMF all the time and consulting on some of these changes that affect millions of people's lives at once in that kind of collective change. We should think about social structures as well. So what are the levers for changing our mass collective experiences? Things like unofficial organizations, mass media, large in-person gatherings or online gatherings. What are the ways that we can change these simultaneous collective experiences in a less formal way? To be really concrete about it, one example that we were thinking about among many is Black Twitter is a completely unofficial organization. It has no board. It's not really an organization. And yet it's recognized as a cultural force that has changed notions of racism, culture, music, society by its presence, right? So these are the kinds of ideas in terms of social structures. And this can be really tricky because our psychological behavioral theories only sometimes actually theorize about structure itself, right? So there are some theories out there that are relevant to structures. So just as an example, social norms theory, just because I work with this a lot, I'm familiar with the ways in which it makes predictions about how leaders and institutions signal new social norms about, for example, the unacceptability of prejudice. So we've been really interested in ways in which Supreme Court rulings can make particular types of biases, say against same-sex marriage or against DACA recipients, less acceptable, right? By officially ruling against them, by codifying it in official law. Of course, there are many ways to use social norms theory in much less structural ways. So, instead of studying Supreme Court decisions, you could test this theory by sending emails to people, reminding them that their leader is progressive. But what we're trying to say is that this is a less structural intervention. We should try to get away from these individualized approaches to changing people and try to think more about the big stuff and understanding, putting our hands around those kinds of interventions and asking what are the effects of those? Where should we be focusing our attention in terms of designing interventions, right? Should it be text messages? But most theories are more individually oriented. I mean, we're psychologists, we're interested in people's mental lives. So I'm not trying to denigrate that. That is our proud tradition. And that's our role in the social sciences, is to help in this perspective. So perspective taking theory is a good example of this. And this has been actually a really successful theory in the prejudice reduction space, predicting that if you take the perspectives of outgroup members, this can reduce prejudice. I want to give an example of a way in which this highly, sort of mentalized, idea of, in my mind, if I have someone else's perspective that can reduce my prejudice, one really structural manifestation is the Brockman and Calla canvassing intervention. So, working, off of the LA LGBT Center's model, canvassers go and have these, deep canvassing conversations with people. They ask for people's opinions or stories about times when they had been discriminated against based on their identity, and then they share, stories that have to do with the issue that they're trying to canvass about, whether it's transgender rights, abortion rights, immigrant rights, etc. What is structural about this? Well, I think that, number one, the person answering the door, first of all, understands that these people are not just having a dyadic conversation with them. They're from an organization that is, talking to many people. And it is an official part of their plan is to ask for their stories, right? So it's one of these more like levers of affecting collective change, because they're doing it with many people. And importantly, they're doing it, as they can see, with everyone in their neighborhood, with their reference group of people around them. And so I think that the Brockman and Calla, even though it's a dyadic intervention, it really counts for me in this conception that I'm putting forward as a structural intervention. And of course, we see many examples of the way that perspective, taking is used in less structural ways, very individualized ways. So not to pick on text, but, another way in which it's been used, right? There are lots of other structural intervention examples. And unfortunately, I hate to tell us this, maybe there are economists in the audience and you'll feel great about this, but I think that economists have been doing this very well by, and particularly economic historians, testing to see whether longstanding institutions change psychology. So looking at institutions of slavery and how it's changed ideology and political ideology or reinforced particular ideologies in certain regions of the country. They've also looked at, institutions like reservations and quotas for particular groups in politics and whether this has affected even implicit bias. So I think that they've actually been doing a very good job of trying to understand how individual psychologies have been affected by structures. I see a raised hand, so I'm happy to take a question here. I'm almost finished and happy to either finish out or chat.
I can promote. Oh, Jason just put his hand down. I guess let's wait till the end then. I don't see him anymore.
Let me finish because I think I have one more slide, and then we'll just I'll take off my screen and open it up. So what do we need in order to do this? I think that we, and now I'm really addressing psychologists, I think we need to, but all behavioral scientists, improve our skills at thinking about the structural expressions of our theories, because they can be expressed as structural ideas, and better at designing more structural interventions. But we're going to need to collaborate in order to carry out some of these projects. We just don't have the resources or the training. I think also, though, that we should immediately get into the project of researching backlash. So if we're going to be interested in a more top-down kind of change, We need to know how different kinds of people and how people in general will receive, these more top-down messages or rules changing. I think it puts us in a really interesting position because, many social scientists are involved in the push for equity reform, structural equity reform, and are justifying it, rightly so, on the basis of values like justice and equity. I think that too, though, another justification, which shouldn't be primary, but sort of may involve more people in this push, is that we need to study them. We need to see how they change our psychologies and not just, the most immediate outcomes that people think of as part of the structural change, which is, different demographic composition or salaries, which, are the most important ones. But this is an additional reason to get involved in those efforts, which I just think is an interesting way to think about this notion of where psychology could go. And then finally, we're going to have to get used to a lot of different kinds of causal identification strategies. So not all of this, I'm very willing to admit, is available to traditional randomization. So we have to get more comfortable with things like regression discontinuity, using instrumental variable analysis, natural experiments. And also, I think that so much of this will have to do with how certain changes are implemented. And I think qualitative process training to understand, to have psychologists at the table when we try to understand, what exactly happened here when we did this big thing, should really be a part of the next generation of prejudice reduction research. Great. So it looks like my screen is hanging up again, but that's just a thank you slide, and it's supposed to have my Dataverse address on it, but here we go. So I'll stop sharing and take questions at this point.
Okay. I'm gonna promote Jason first since he had his hand up, and then there are 3 hands and a question in the chat.
So Stephen, should I wait for people to talk now? Okay, great.
Yeah, they'll pop up. Yeah.
Hey.
Hi.
Yeah, okay. Good to see you. Also, wow, what timing. As soon as your paper came out, I've already cited this thing 3-4 times and some papers under review. And so thanks for this incredible work. It's very important work. Before we really needed to rely on some of the work like Calvin Ly's intervention tournaments to see how we may be a little bit too excited about these different strategies. And so I really love the opportunity to speak with you. So I'm gonna reach out to you to have a longer conversation because I'll be presenting here in IPSR next week about ways we can approach this. So without speaking to that, all the stuff I'm gonna present, I just wanna ask a high level, if we're finding this, we're finding these mixed effects, we're finding these short-lived effects, things like publication bias, the measurement issues with the IAT, could it be the case that we might be barking up the wrong tree, like the whole conversation in and of itself, that the objective, we've been thinking of it as the objective is to get rid of people's bias, to de-bias people, do away with the bias itself, as opposed to more of that, I think you may have been touching on it when it came to things like equity or something like that, where the outcome is the actual, did you mitigate the racial achievement gap? Such that people can still have their bias, but to what extent does that bias actually lead to the big real world things of interest to us, the things that come in the legal field is whatever legalese they use for fundamentally different outcomes according to different groups and things like that. So just any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I think about this kind of thing a lot. Thanks for bringing this up. So I think that in some ways, it's a question of where you want to start, and what field you want to be in. So, psychologists think about the mind and attitudes and bias. And so it's natural to think about that. And And I think that some of the debate about like whether we should at all is really well illustrated by some of the recent work on algorithms, right? And so, if algorithms are making a lot of our decisions for us and it's really hard to change people, then why don't you just change the algorithms? And I'm all for that, right? So if you want to start with algorithms, and if you're like a computational and machine learning scientist, I think you still need psychology for that, right? It's still humans who are building those. And then much of the work has moved on to say, like, well, when are humans going to accept, algorithmic suggestions, right? Some of it we don't have choices over accepting, but we're still going to interact with machines as well. So people always come back into it, and so maybe our goals for just, trying to change everybody are off. It still seems like we should have ways to try to get certain members of the population on board who are critical decision makers and who would, commission work that would change, things like algorithms or institutional structures and rules, things that would really promote the kind of equity outcomes I was talking about. So I think that there's a role for both. So maybe it's, maybe it's a way of thinking about how you want to target prejudice reduction. But then again, I mean, I mentioned, Brockman and Kalla's work, and they show that their changes are related to vote, choices, right? And so, we also have popular referenda. We also have issues where we think, well, how do we communicate to the public? Like some things are really important to get a public consensus on. And we know that people who call their politicians, are the ones who are driving a lot of, policy efforts by those politicians. How do you, foment that kind of collective action in pushing for, racial justice, et cetera. So I think you still need to think about bias, even as we think about more top-down solutions. You can't take the humans out of it. And so that's my attitude. And I think that like my goal is just to try to figure out like, well, what's the best way to do it? But I agree with you. It's not the only way. And but the pesky human problem is going to rear its head no matter what strategy you take. So we ought to know, like we ought to have some workable solutions in our pocket is my idea.
I have some stuff you would like to see then.
What's that?
I have some stuff you'd like to see then. It's coming. We're working on it.
Plug. Everyone should come next week. In fact, if you invite me back, I'll come next week. I want to hear it too.
I would love that, but also seriously, it's work with Gregory Walton, Lasana Harris. We love the work you're doing. Would love to talk to you, but I'll reach out to you separately.
Jason, I'm going to move you back to attendee. And then Betsy, there are 2 questions in the chat from students that I've been requested to ask, so I'll just give you paraphrased versions. So one is that given the lack of support for various theories and interventions you detailed, what are your thoughts on potential ethical ramifications of taking these theories and interventions to the real world? And then the second is on the scale of institutional interventions. So in particular, theory from economics suggests that changing institutions can take centuries and millennia. And so how should we think about access points for interventions at institutional levels?
Okay. So in terms of the ethics, should you use an intervention that has no evidence, has no convincing evidence that it should work? Unfortunately, what I'm telling you is that there's a lot of it, that many interventions can be described as such. So I would say that we don't have evidence of harm. I think that, we're talking about such a broad, category. I don't know how to comment in general. I think that, one of the things we call for in the paper is more research in the context of places where you're actually doing these interventions so that we can measure the outcomes that we care about. So I think for at least discovery purposes, we need to know. I think that it's just realistically not going to stop. I long ago spoke with a diversity trainer who said, everybody, who uses diversity training, they've either seen the light or they feel the fire, right? So they're being threatened, legally. That legal threat is not going to go away. Corporations and universities and governments still need interventions in order to respond to, legal problems. And so it's just going to keep happening. It's not really even in our purview, but I think that trying to direct people to, empirically supported interventions would be great, but we need a lot of work to do that. So we kind of have to get to work knowing that this is just going to happen, whether we like it or not. The other question was about institutional change over millennia. Oh God, I think that that's not true though. I think that like really consequential stuff happens all the time. And, the earned income tax credit, like when you think about like some of the domestic, but then also international, with the sweep of a pen, the things that happen at the IMF that deeply, deeply affect people's lives. I think that I'd like psychologists to be sitting at the table thinking about humans and how they interact with laws and institutions and how they'll understand them or not understand them. And I think that we shouldn't think that way as psychologists at all. I think that we should think of ourselves as part of, I just basically am trying to ask psychologists not to think that we have to design the interventions. We should be there when the interventions are being designed. I think that we have so much research to help people design them better, but we don't have to think about, covering prejudice reduction in 15 minutes with one of our classic small interventions. We could think about being there for the design of the really heavy lifts when they're building new subways, like what kind of cars could provide, safe places for, women identifying people. Where could you put, discrete phone booths so that people could go and report that they're being abused at home? There are so many ways to jump in and design really big things with what we know about psychology. So I think maybe that's a way to reorient thinking about institutions and big stuff, even stuff that's like, made of concrete.
Thanks. And then I have 3 hands. So I'm first going to promote David Brockman.
Hello. Lots of things happened to my screen just now, but it's great to see you, Betsy. Thanks so much for doing this. It's great to have you at Berkeley, virtually anyway. So I guess so many interesting things from the talk and paper, which I really enjoyed reading for a second time. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on the kind of duration question, which you kind of alluded to at different points in your talk. And because as you know from our work, like this is what we keep finding, that the effects of these conversations last. And to be frank, we like always gesture towards like, maybe this is why, but we haven't, yet done the study where we can say, well, when we take this away, this ingredient away, you get the initial effect, but it doesn't last. And so I think I've always had kind of 2 hunches about this. One is maybe more optimistic, which is that it's something about like a system 2 active processing type story that, when you have a 2-way conversation or something, very novel is happening to you, like someone's at your door, you just kind of think about it more, remember it more in much the same way that, students in our classes, we know if we want them to remember content, or we think we know anyway, that we should get them to use it and think it through. That's one interpretation. Another interpretation is a little bit less optimistic, which is that maybe, even though we've often tried to do issues that are more charged or salient, or there's kind of a broader like national political context where the issue is being debated, you can imagine that there's just not really that much like focused, xenophobic or like anti-immigrant, for example, communication or anti-trans communication that people are getting. And so it might just be that our intervention is just the last thing they've heard, but were there to be, truly some salient event like an undocumented immigrant, happens to kill someone in their neighborhood, and then there's, press coverage for a week about it or something, that could just displace everything that happened. So that's another view, which is more pessimistic and has more to do with the context and the intervention. So I'm stuck within, my little intervention, that way of thinking about it, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts like broadly on how to think about that question of durability and what could be interesting there.
What's interesting about that, David, is that in your work, you try to stress test the change, right? I mean, you've, shown people attack ads and,
Yes.
and found that, there's some faltering, but it endures, which is like one of the more like awesome and convincing things that you do in showing this long-term change.
Not to interrupt, but I should say real fast, per your point, just for all the students, that idea was actually from the practitioners we were working with. And I think it was a great idea. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Well, you are like one of the, you and Josh just, listen to practitioners. And that's something definitely for all the students, but for all of us, like to emphasize that, there are people out there who have amazing ideas, and you'll find that you'll hear echoes of our theories in there. They arrived at them completely separately, but you can still do theoretical testing with these people who have amazing ideas, because they keep testing them on the ground in that Kahneman style of like, you can get things down to like intuition because you keep getting feedback again and again and again. So that's why, like, weather people and like firefighters like have, intuition, they can make predictions. Okay. So I was thinking this the other day in a talk on morality, strangely, but I want to connect it back to us. And with apologies to David Sears, I think that like a lot of ways in which we measure prejudice are sort of, we could categorize them as like more basic versus more like policy related. And I think you've done a lot of policy related measurements of prejudice, right? And I think that one thing, at least, that like these conversations that you're measuring, and then, conversations that happen in a lot of other interventions do, is that the ways that you apply a prejudice and try to figure out how you feel about people moving into a neighborhood, about a particular policy. What I was observing in this talk on morality is that it was about, sort of like morally complicated issues. And they were showing that, you can change the way people's moral views on these sort of morally complicated issues. And I kind of thought to myself, is that changing people's morality, or are they just like working out a path toward this issue, right? Which is imbued with morality. And sometimes I think about that way with a lot of things having to do with prejudice, that you may remain with some, ingrained, culturally, gifted and rehearsed prejudices, but conversations and classes and, new cultural toolboxes, way to like talk about things, can help you find a path towards supporting, a law that's more friendly to immigration, right? And so it's kind of both a pessimistic and an optimistic view, because I think that, I was trying to classify some of these effect sizes in terms of a feeling thermometer, and maybe that's not really what we're after. We're after helping people to find a path toward having more positive attitudes toward, policy objects and some of these more complex issues that have to do with prejudice. So that could be one way that we find these lasting effects, is that you've given them the path. They're not just going to keep relying on their feeling thermometers. They're going to say, well, like, now I've come to a resolution about how I feel about transgender people using bathrooms. And, maybe that, could feed back into the feeling thermometer, but maybe it doesn't have to. I don't know. I'm not sure. We need more people measuring things long-term. You guys were one of the only research groups that did so. And I think that we'll have more ideas about this when we have more examples of things that endure.
Awesome. Thank you.
Dana, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, we have time for one more question, sure.
Okay, I saw Ari's hand first. I'm going to promote her to panelist.
I feel like it's so intense to become a panelist because everything goes away and then comes back. But
it's exciting to wait for your arrival. I can tell you that from this end.
Well, thank you so much for a lovely talk. I actually feel like a lot of places that I had questions, you ended up tapping into, like kind of thinking about, do we need to reconceptualize prejudice, or like feeling thermometers, or however we measure it, as like, is it appropriately a mediator, or is it kind of something that we're happy if it comes along for the ride? But, in terms of speaking through the lens of structures and what structural change looks like and what implications that has. I feel like for a while I've been caught in this idea of, as psychologists, we like to sit in this kind of middle ground of interactions like as our big thing, and not really at that structural level, but also like in thinking about the way that we frame our questions, and how does it have implications when you really capture that like cultural space. So what I mean by this is really in this way that we ask, how long does something last, right? Like how long does an effect last? But I think that has really different implications when you ask, is the structure around us supporting this effect, or is it constantly pushing against it? And so I was just kind of wondering if you have like kind of thoughts on, you know, how can we in some ways transition the way that we're thinking about this so that we can fundamentally align structural understandings with our what do effects lasting look like, or even like on a practical level, should papers really have a place dedicated where they describe our sociocultural context, to really maintain this space? I mean, I think what I love and stresses me out at the same time about so much of the prejudice literature is that there's ways when I think our field implicitly does this thing that says, well, you know, prejudice towards Black people isn't like this anymore. We're not saying that those results aren't valid. We just like can't use those measures. It's a different phenomenon, right? But it means that we kind of drop all of that and say like, okay, new version of prejudice now. Whereas if you kind of capture the structural and socio-historical context, could that mean that all of these things remain part of our generative theory making, and can be applicable in the like future psychology generations? So I don't know, I just kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on like, what does it look like to incorporate structure as a fundamental piece of our theorizing, at both a global and a practical level?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you just gave us a lot of great suggestions for that. So maybe I'll highlight a few that I really resonate with. I mean, I think that one point, if I'm following you correctly, one point that you just brought up is that, you know, instead of turning to like the assumed origins of inequity, saying it's the racist, you know, ideas in people's heads and beliefs and emotions, and oh, look, it's those emotions have changed, so now racism must have changed. Starting instead with what are the outcomes that we observe, the inequities, and then like how does psychology maintain those, which is a fundamentally different question of psychology. And then I think that another theme, so I think that that's a really like excellent way to like re-theorize and to think through like, what psychologies do you need to understand racial inequity and discrimination and violence? You know, what types of psychologies support them? And suddenly you're not talking about feeling thermometers maybe, right? Like, because who has data connecting a feeling thermometer with a hate crime, you know? Mm-hmm. Actually some people, but there's a lot of other things. There's a lot of other psychologies, right? It's not just that, right? So, and it gets into questions of community. So, you know, some of the work that my advisor worked on a long time ago was about perceptions of community acceptance of hate crime and prejudice as a motivator for people who actually commit a hate crime. So, But that's still getting to the individual psychology. I think the other thing that I heard you say was that in describing the context of an intervention, you know, it puts the onus on you to describe what might be extinguishing a change contextually, like what is the extinguisher and what might be a facilitator of change. And yeah, that again shifts the onus, it shifts the focus to saying like, well, okay, what are extinguishers and what are facilitators of these kinds of more equitable interactions or representation in the context? And it, like, to me, that gets very close to what we're saying about, you know, intervening in structures. It's saying, you know, what in the context suppresses or extinguishes what facilitates certain types of behaviors. Let's work on that. And then if the feeling thermometers, not to pick on them again, follow, that's interesting. That's super interesting. I mean, I was shocked when some economists showed that implicit bias toward women and women leaders changed after quotas for local women leaders changed in their villages in India. I was totally shocked by that. it's really interesting, but they didn't do implicit bias trainings to try to get quotas for women implemented, right? So it's just a different way of thinking about, the ways that psychologies facilitate versus the way contexts facilitate. So I'm just echoing what you said. I think that there's like so much there in what you said, and we could have a much longer discussion about it, but I think we're really in agreement.
Thank you. I just generally love to hear you speak in all your work. So I'm like, oh.
Thank you. I'm really enjoying this. So keep it coming. Keep in touch.
Yes, and on that, I'll say I think we all really just enjoy listening to Betsy Levy Paluck speak, and we're so happy that she joined us today. Thank you, Betsy, so much for coming.